Growing the same crops in different gardens has been one of the more interesting aspects of this Red Gardens project. We generally grow the same variety in each of the gardens and try to stick with that same variety year after year to be able to make better comparisons and to help identify differences in the various gardening methods that we are trialing. Using the same variety can also be very useful to compare different years to see if crops are gradually getting better or how different seasons can affect the cropping of different plants that we grow. Perhaps most importantly, this consistency can help identify when something isn't right and to perhaps narrow down the possible reasons why plants are not doing as well as they could. And this year there was a few issues with the courgette or zucchini crops that we grew, which seemed to be related to issues of fertility, microclimate, and pollination, or perhaps a combination of all three. The crop of courgettes from the extensive garden didn't produce the highest yield per area, but it was quite good when I calculated the average weight of courgettes each plant produced. And this is what I would expect from these plants that are given a lot of space to grow into. And the number of courgettes produced per plant was also quite good, better than some of the other gardens, which isn't something I would necessarily expect. And the courgettes in this garden generally did better than the same crop did in past years. And for the first part of the season, they were doing better than most of the other gardens. But then after mid-September, there was a definite decline in productivity. The number of fruit being produced suddenly dropped right off. One plant suffered rot in its stem and died back, and others suffered from powdery mildew, perhaps more than in the other gardens. I suspect that there was good soil fertility for the start of the season, and then perhaps some of the nutrients began to become less available, and I probably should have side-dressed these hungry plants with additional compost or concentrated fertility halfway through the growing season. Looking at the results for the full season, the courgette plants in the no-dig garden did better than any of the other gardens. Compared to the extensive garden, the no-dig plants produced slightly more fruit and more harvest per plant, and given the two gardens had similar plant densities, the yield measured in kilograms per square meter was also higher. But looking at the details of what was produced during the season, the plants in the no-dig garden were a bit behind those of the extensive garden, and it was only the abrupt drop in harvest of one garden and the continued cropping in the other that caused the no-dig garden to come out on top. All four plants in this no-dig garden seemed to be in good shape for longer after the other gardens lost plants, which seems to indicate that the fertility management of this gardening method was able to continue to supply these plants with what was needed late into the year. I suspect that the layer of compost that had been added in the spring was only really starting to decompose and release fertility later in the season, which could explain the slightly slower start, and there have been definite improvements in this garden after 2 years of poor yields, so it seems we're finally starting to see the potential benefits of this method. It is interesting that there was an extra boost of harvest in mid-October, and this was because one of the courgettes remained hidden from view and had grown into a large marrow by the time we found it, and this distorted the data. I think this was the only one of the season, as we were generally quite good at keeping on top of the harvests, but it shows how easily that the comparisons of harvests can be distorted if these fast-growing plants aren't harvested consistently enough. The courgette crop in the intensive garden had the highest yield per area, which is to be expected with this garden as there are 6 plants in a space occupied by only 4 in the other gardens. But there was a poor yield and fewer fruit produced per plant, which I find interesting, and these plants did worse than the same crop last year, which is a shame because I was hoping for even a better harvest. Part of the issue this year was that the young courgette plants were transplanted into a bed of spinach, and the two crops were intercropped beside each other for a few weeks. The courgette plants struggled from the start and never really caught up, and were not very healthy even later in the season. This was in spite of what I thought would be much better growing conditions, as I covered the full bed with a large cold frame, creating a better microclimate. I suspect the plastic made it more difficult for the bees to find the flowers, so more of the fruit was unpollinated, which I discarded. But unfortunately I didn't count them to determine if this fully explained the lower number of courgettes. This would have caused part of the lower yield, at least at the beginning of the season, as later on we did a fair amount of hand pollination to ensure that we could get a larger crop. But I think the general poor health of the plants was due to inadequate soil fertility, and competition between the closely spaced courgette plants probably only made things worse. Of all the crops, the courgettes in the polyculture garden were the worst, mainly due to competition from the adjacent vegetables that they had shared the space with. I also didn't amend the soil with additional compost or fertility just before transplanting, after the early radishes had been harvested. The roots of the more established plants in neighboring clusters would have colonized much of the soil around the new courgette transplants, and the courgettes didn't seem to get access to significant amounts of fertility that they need to grow well, and ended up producing less than half the weight and number of fruit as the more successful crop of the extensive garden. At least this was the case until the end of August. After that, the plants continued to produce approximately as well as the other gardens. This would have coincided with me finally harvesting some spring and early summer crops that were surrounding the courgettes, some of which were very overdue and delayed, and I didn't plant anything in to replace them as I had originally planned to. And this left some of the courgette plants with significantly more space than in the other gardens, but a few of them were still struggling, and that is to be expected of the more random planting arrangements of this kind of garden. The courgettes in this polyculture garden definitely did better than they did in previous years, but there's still lots of room to improve the methods for growing these large, hungry plants in amongst other crops. The courgettes in the polytunnel produced the worst out of all the crops this year, at least when evaluating them for the full growing season. They got off to a really good start, producing courgettes before any of the other gardens because of the warmer microclimate they were growing in, even though they were from the same batch of plants. But then at the end of July, one of the 4 plants started to wilt and died suddenly, caused by a rotted patch in the lower part of the stem. And then 2 more had the same issue in mid-August, and the last one died off in the first week of September. This rotting may be caused by a burrowing pest, but I could not find any trace of one, and it has happened quite often in the past with the polytunnel plants. It seems that they can only grow so big, or last for only part of the season in this garden, and I think I will plant a succession of plants next year, with ones sown later being able to continue to provide courgettes when the earlier ones end up having problems. But it is interesting that these plants were able to produce as much in 2 months as the plants in the polyculture and intensive garden were able to produce in a 4-month period. And while all 4 plants were going well, they produced between 1.5 and 3 times as much as the most successful crop outside. Part of this may be due to better fertility management, but I think the warmth of this protected microclimate and shelter from the wind are the key reasons why they were able to produce so much more. But we were also much more focused on hand-pollinating the flowers in the polytunnel for a lot of the season, so this may also be part of the success with these plants. Looking at the growth rates, or the changing rate of how much we were able to harvest from all of the different courgette crops, the season can be divided into 5 different phases, which seem to coincide in part to the changes of the weather. The first phase saw the very slow growth in the outside gardens and quite rapid growth in the polytunnel garden during a slightly cool period of weather that we had up until the first week of July. This shows the definite benefit of the polytunnel microclimate. For 2 weeks in the middle of July, we had unseasonably warm weather, which saw a definite increase in the extensive and no-dig gardens to about the same as the polytunnel garden, but the polyculture and intensive gardens lagged behind because of fertility issues. For most of August, the rates of growth in the extensive and no-dig gardens remained fairly consistent. The intensive and polyculture gardens trailed off a bit, and the polytunnel garden dropped off entirely as the plants died. And it was during this phase of more typical weather that the differences between the gardens really spread. For the first half of September, all of the outside gardens slowed down a bit with the slightly cooler weather, and for the final phase of about 6 weeks, from mid-September right through to the end of October, saw fairly consistent production in 3 of the gardens, but the extensive garden couldn't keep up. From about mid-August to the end of October, the weather was quite a bit warmer than what we would normally get, and this would account for some of the increase in yield this year compared to the 2 previous years. There are a few other factors here, so it's hard to really evaluate things, but I don't think that we can claim credit for the overall increase in productivity this year, as I suspect a lot of it simply comes down to the weather. So, the courgette plants in the extensive garden were fine, but next year I will make sure to side dress with additional fertility, and to spray the leaves with dilute milk to try to slow down the powdery mildew on the older leaves, but that is the same with all the gardens. In the no-dig garden, I think adding the top-up layer of a lot of compost in the autumn will ensure that there is enough active decomposition to release enough nutrients for these hungry plants earlier in the season. But I also plan to spread some chicken manure pellets to amend the compost I've been using, which is not very rich. With the intensive garden, I'm going to avoid planting a fertility extracting crop like spinach before the courgettes, or to make sure I top up on the fertility, and to resist the urge to intercrop these plants. I'm going to use a cold frame again next year, as I'm really interested in finding out how much better these plants can grow in a better microclimate. But I'm probably going to reduce the number of plants in this enclosed space in anticipation of them all growing a bit bigger if I can sort out the fertility issues. With the polyculture garden, I plan to add a lot of compost to the planting location before transplanting the courgette plants, and to be more attentive about harvesting and removing the neighboring established plants. I also need to be mindful about how much space these courgette plants need as they grow, and it will be interesting to see how well the later sowings of other crops will do beside these more aggressive established courgette plants. In the polytunnel garden, I'm going to grow 2 or 3 batches of courgettes, about 4 or 6 weeks apart, to ensure a succession of actively cropping younger plants, and to plan to replace the more established plants with other crops, unless I can figure out how I can prevent the rotting of the stems from happening in the future. So for next year, there is a combination of avoiding some of the mistakes I made this year, adjusting how to manage the plants and soil fertility later on in the season, changing the planting plans in some of the gardens, and keeping an eye on when we may need to step in and hand pollinate the flowers. All of this is part of the gradual learning process, which is made a lot more interesting with the different methods that we are trying. And it will be interesting to see how well we can get the plants to grow in each of the different gardens, and how well they'll produce and compare to other years, especially if we get different weather conditions.